Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. Everyone knows what McDonald's is, and I'm sure we've all eaten there at least once. When thinking about the biggest companies in the world, it's hard to come up with a list of 5 of them without mentioning McDonald's somewhere near the top. They are fast food titans, the epitome of success in their industry, for better or for worse. McDonald's just recently celebrated the birthday of none other than Grimace, one of their most recognizable mascots in their character roster. To celebrate it, they released a video game. We'll talk more about the specifics of that a bit later, but this prompted me to check out all the other licensed video games they've released over the years. Back in the 8 and 16-bit days, it was super common for brands to release licensed video games, and McDonald's had a bunch of them, most of which I've never played. So today, I'm gonna go back and check out every McDonald's game released throughout the years. But first, I want to take a minute to talk about this video's sponsor, Pocket Champs.
Pocket Champs is a free-to-play game for iOS and Android where you get to train your very own little buddy and then watch him race against other Pocket Champs in running, swimming, and climbing. Your role here is to coach your champ and unlock its potential by choosing the right kind of training for upcoming races by strategizing through world analysis and gadget selection. Trusting that you did your best to train them, sit back and then watch them race. My favorite part is getting to upgrade my equipment to get just the edge I need to have my little guy beat out all the other champs, as well as frequently unlocking new unique race courses. Pocket Champs also has a surprising amount of skins available. And speaking of, I've partnered with Pocket Champs to offer you guys my favorite skin, the White Wolf. If you click the link in my description or scan the QR code to download Pocket Champs, the White Wolf skin will be automatically added to your account on August 15th. This exclusive reward is worth $9.99, but it's only going to be available until August 14th, so hop to it and download Pocket Champs today from the link in my description or my QR code, which really helps out the channel. So hurry up and go get that White Wolf skin before the offer goes away. And thanks, of course, to Pocket Champs for sponsoring the video. Alright, so, a lot of you are familiar with how this works, but as usual, we're going to go in chronological order here, checking out every video game McDonald's has ever released over the years, all the way up till present day. Very straightforward this time. There might be a game or two here that are a little weird to include, but the mass majority of these are regular console releases anyone could have walked into a game store and bought. With that being said, let's check out what the Big M had up their McSleeve. So, the first game McDonald's ever released actually never even came out over here in the States. Instead of being a worldwide release, this one stayed over in Japan, a platformer called Donaldland, released exclusively for the Famicom. Now, even though this isn't the biggest secret in the world, I'm sure there's at least a couple of you thinking to yourself, wait, what the f*** do you mean Donaldland? Well, turns out over in Japan, Ronald's name isn't Ronald, it's Donald. Donald McDonald. I don't think I need to go for the low-hanging fruit here, so let's just leave it at, that sure is silly. Anyway, we have an 8-bit platformer starring Donald McDonald. It's pretty much as straightforward as retro platformers get in terms of what kind of game this is, but its quirkiness and controls are what sets this game apart, for better or for worse. Now, the premise of the game is pretty simple. All of Ronald, or Donald, look, I'm just going to call him Dronald McDonald. All of Dronald's friends, including familiar faces like Grimace, Birdie, and Mayor McCheese, have all been kidnapped by this evil clown wizard thing, and now it's up to Dronald to make his way through 12 stages and save them. Instead of them all lying at the end of the game, though, you save them one by one as you defeat the bosses of the various stages, but we'll get to those in a bit. Now, levels are all very straightforward platforming fare. It's all your typical make-it-to-the-end stages with various platforms, enemies, and the occasional power-up or health pickup. Dronald can run, jump, and throw bombs, and I'll be very upfront here and say, while I admit, overall, this is a relatively enjoyable game, it's only after you get past the piss-poor controls. It's bad, man. It's real bad. It's floaty as hell. The physics seem to make no sense. It's kind of hard to convey by just telling you, but how this game calculates momentum seems to be a roll of the dice. It's all manageable, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't kind of frustrating. The controls aren't bad enough that you can't rein them in, but it's only after you get used to their weird nuances that it starts to feel less egregious, and it never really fully goes away. The poor controls pretty much permeate the entire game, and in certain instances, like really precise, borderline pixel-perfect jumps that pop up a couple of times throughout the game, it might actually make you rage quit. Luckily, the game does have unlimited continues, but I won't blame you for using save states. Anyway, Dronald can also throw bombs for some reason, and that's your only means of attack. The bomb-throwing physics also, unsurprisingly, make no sense, and even when you feel like you finally have a feel for them, sometimes it still doesn't work how you think it's supposed to. But much like the movement controls, it is manageable, especially since you can throw bombs down at the ground, which is about 500 times more reliable. Enemies can be taken out with bombs, but you can also stand on their heads to use them as a platform, which sometimes is actually necessary to progress, so you kind of need to assess each area with a little bit of caution before blindly chucking bombs all willy-nilly. Now, the levels themselves are actually pretty decent looking. They're all really colorful and unique looking, and while I think shit like these trees are creepy, they are a nice touch overall. There's a couple of stages that switch up the gameplay, namely the underwater and sky levels, which require you to swim and float through the air respectively. The swimming requires you to tap the A button to surface while using the D-pad to navigate, and in the sky level, you need to press the direction you want to go in. These are both very slow and very unresponsive. Much like the regular controls, these controls also seem to have a mind of their own, and even when you know the rules, the game doesn't always play by them. In the regular stages, there's also bomb jumping, where you kind of throw a bomb and then jump on top of it. I never really got the hang of this, and because the controls are so finicky, I managed to get through the game without ever properly doing a true bomb jump, but throwing bombs while you're in the air does increase your airtime a bit, so I still strong-arm my way through it. Like I said earlier, this game has a bunch of bosses, which actually are, for the most part, pretty fun or at least decent. They mostly just require you to dodge their attacks and aim bombs at a specific weak point, and most of them are just challenging enough to be enjoyable without being too overly frustrating, and the boss designs, for the most part, are pretty creative too, like this wooden dragon thing that spits fire, or this thing. Now, after each stage, we have a little bonus prize minigame, not too dissimilar to Mario 3's card matching game. In each stage, you can collect these burger tokens, and after you beat the level, you have two options. You can spend them directly to purchase lives, health, or a bomb upgrade, which I didn't mention before, but I'm not quite sure what these even do because I haven't seemed to notice a difference once obtained, but it's there. Anyway, you can spend burger tokens to purchase items, or use them to purchase food from McDonald's, which allows you to try your luck at the matching game. Once again, not sure what the difference is between the foods you purchase, but purchasing them is the only way to play the minigame, which itself is admittedly pointless. If you only uncover one Dronald, you get a bomb upgrade. Match 2, get a heart. Match 3, get a free life. If you select a Hamburglar card, though, the game ends. This is largely pointless, and honestly, you're better off spending your hard-earned cash on the items themselves, and I don't see why anyone would voluntarily choose to play the minigame unless they have a gambling problem. Anyway, after you beat all the stages and bosses, you face off against the clown wizard thing, who is actually pretty easy. His pattern is very obvious, and his attacks are easily avoided once you learn his pattern. Defeat him, and you win the game. You've saved all your friends and became a hero of Donaldland, denoted by this giant platform that reads as such, just in case it wasn't abundantly clear. So here's a game that made me want to rip my hair out. The first McDonald's game to come out over here in the US, and 30 years later, we still can't even figure out what it's called. Some people call it McKids, some people call it MC Kids, neither of which makes sense because on the cartridge it says M.C Kids, which also doesn't make any sense, but considering McDonald's naming scheme, my headcanon says it's McKids. The game is set up similarly to Mario 3 in terms of its layout. You have an overworld full of levels, some of which can be played out of order, platforming stages, and bonus games. The main characters of the game are Mick and Mac, and they've been tasked by Ronald to retrieve his magic bag, which has been stolen by the Hamburglar. You need to make your way through the 6 worlds, completing each platforming stage, but there's a catch here. You can't simply reach the end of the stage to beat it. Each world has a certain number of M cards hidden throughout the stage, and you need to collect a certain amount of them in each world to progress. Now, for the most part, the cards in the stages correlate to the world you're currently in, but not always. See, some stages contain both cards belonging to other worlds as well as secret cards for a hidden world. Because of this, the game does require a bit of backtracking if you didn't already collect every single card in previous levels. This is a big pain in the ass because you may find yourself short one card and then not know which previous stage has the card you missed. Now it's 2023, and I can just pick up my phone and Google it. It took me a little more reading than I would have liked, but I was able to find where the cards I was missing were located fairly quickly. At the time this game came out, though, it's absolutely insane that they designed it this way, with no way of knowing where or when you missed the important collectible that you need to progress. But anyway, much like the last game, you have no means of attack outside of throwing an object. Unlike Donaldland, though, you have no projectile weapon, and instead need to rely on picking up blocks scattered throughout the stages if you want to take any enemies out, which admittedly usually isn't super necessary anyway. I'm gonna just be straight up here and tell you this game is frustrating as hell, and if I didn't have access to save states, there's no way I would have gotten through even half of it. Enemy placement is super cheap, and the game often likes to throw them right where you're about to land and doesn't actually give you enough time to react. The controls are insanely slippery, and honestly, they were somehow less tight than Donaldland's. At least that game I was able to enjoy once I got the hang of the controls. This one, though, this one never got fun for me. There seems to be even less content in this game that's actually McDonald's related than the last game. Donaldland at least had the shop where you could buy burgers and shit. This game is just focused on the characters themselves, making no reference at all to the fast food chain. This isn't exactly a negative thing, because I don't really need McNuggies in my video game to find enjoyment, but what I do need is at the very least a decently designed game, which this is not. I know some people have fond memories of this one and like it, but I just personally do not see it. The game does have a two-player mode set up similarly to Super Mario 3, trading off each time someone dies. Player 1 and Player 2 play as Mick and Mac respectively, who have identical controls, but when playing one player, the characters can be swapped during bonus stages by touching these moon blocks. I wish I had more to say about this one, but it's just frustrating and unremarkable. It's very derivative of its contemporaries, but with the added feature of the card collecting requirement, which does nothing to boost my enjoyment here. I guess one cool mechanic in the game are these little spin blocks that flip you over, as well as reverse the gravity when you run over them, but this mechanic is super underutilized. The few times the game actually uses it, it adds a new layer of depth to the level design and adds a bit of a puzzle platforming element, but these moments are few and far between. One thing to note, though, was that there was a version of this game that didn't include the card system that never actually came out in America. Sort of. See, in Europe, this game was released under the name McDonald's Land, and with it came a Game Boy port. It's not a direct port, though, as the stage layouts are different, the game controls a bit different, and the card collection thing is nowhere to be seen. Instead, it's a typical straightforward platforming. Same story, too, just truncated a bit. Now, I say it never came out in America, but this is technically only half true. It's true that the Game Boy version of McKids/McDonald's Land never came out here. However, the game was released in a different form. Assets were changed, and the game was released here as Spot, the Cool Adventure, as one of the many Sprite Soda games using the Cool Spot character. The games, aside from their assets, are identical. The world layout, stage design, and enemies are all intact. This was a weird practice that actually was pretty common back in the 80s and 90s, but I'm not sure why they didn't just go with releasing a Game Boy version of McKids over here. In any case, though, I f***ing hated this one. Donald Land, despite its controls and lack of polish, was miles better than this. If you enjoy this one, listen, I'm happy for you, but this will be the last time I boot this game up. Hey, real quick, if you're watching the video and just so happen to find yourself loving it, consider subscribing. It really helps out now more than ever now that I've been doing these longer projects, so if you want to see more stuff from me, maybe tap that button. Anyway, that's all I gotta say. Back to the Mick video. So I'm not really sure how I should classify this one. It's sort of a sequel, but not really. I think it's considered either a pseudo-sequel or a spiritual successor, but I'm not quite sure what's most accurate. In any case, released in the same year as the original game, is Mick and Mac as the Global Gladiators for the Sega Genesis. Like the previous game, I'm not really sure on the official title, as the box says Mick and Mac as the Global Gladiators, but I often see it referred to as just Global Gladiators, and for the sake of saving myself precious syllables, we're just gonna go with the latter here. Unlike the first game, which was, for all intents and purposes, a straightforward platforming game, this one takes a bit of a run-and-gun approach. Gone are nearly every single reference to McDonald's, save for the golden arches and one of the most grotesque incarnations of Ronald himself. This game's entire aesthetic is totally different from the first game. Instead of a playful and fun aesthetic of the first game, this one is more gross and gritty and far more resembles something like Earthworm Jim than its predecessor. You play as either Mick or Mac and have to navigate through 4 worlds, each containing 3 stages, and make it to the end while avoiding enemies and collecting colored M's. Save for the final stage, but we'll get to that in a little bit. The levels really aren't anything to write home about, honestly, and there's basically zero creativity in them in terms of level design. The levels aren't really designed in a way that challenges your platforming, puzzle, or navigation skill, and instead, you have a really small window of view to just kind of try to make your way to the end, jumping to whichever path is most convenient. You also occasionally pick up lives or health pickups as you traverse the stages, and if you're anything like me, you're gonna need it. The game has some of the most unrelenting, messy, and unfair enemy utilization I've ever seen in a video game like this. Basically, everywhere you look, everywhere you walk, there's an enemy in the way, in your path, above your head, on a platform you need to use to progress, and this wouldn't be that big of a deal if it wasn't for the fact that they're all constantly slinging projectiles at you, never once letting up. Your only means of defense is like the shittiest gun I've ever seen that shoots something gooey to combat your enemies' slime attacks, but your options for aiming here are barely existent. There's like only a couple directions you can even aim, and they aren't precise at all. And honestly, most of the time you're better off just button mashing and brute forcing your way through instead of trying to be strategic. The enemies are easily taken out, but you'll probably find yourself getting hit multiple times in like 60% of run-ins with enemies. I was kind of screwed in this one because for this game, I had no save states. I'm not really the type of person to use save states if I'm just playing a game for my own enjoyment, but when it comes to making videos, the last thing I want to do is increase my workload exponentially because I'm wasting a bunch of time fighting a video game. If it wasn't for the fact that I was able to find a level skip code and an extra lives code, I wouldn't have even made it past the second world. Luckily, those codes did exist and I was at least able to see the end of the game. When you get to the last stage, you face off against the game's only boss, a face in the side of an iceberg or something. I don't know what happened here, but whatever I was playing on wasn't running the game correctly, so the face is all glitched out. Honestly, I know a lot of people praise this game, but boy, I did not have a fun time here. I actually surprisingly enjoyed MC Kids or McKids or whatever a lot more than this. That game was unpolished and frustrating, but this one is just a mess. A big, difficult mess. I hated this. The music was decent though. I wonder who wrote it. Oh no, I guess it has more in common with Earthworm Jim than I realized. You know, I'm still wondering what happened here because this really had almost zero to do with McDonald's at all besides the intro cutscene. I thought McKids deviated in that regard, but this one takes it even further. If it wasn't for the golden arches and Ronald, nobody would have any idea this was a McDonald's game. Also worth noting, this game did get a port to the Sega Master System as well as the Game Gear. In typical fashion with situations like these with both the Game Gear and Master System, we have an 8-bit port that never made its way to the US. If you know anything about these kinds of ports, you know they're both the same exact game, except the Game Gear version has an egregious amount of screen crunch. Par for the course for games that came out on both these systems since they're basically the same system, just one having a tiny screen. As far as this port goes, it's pretty much just a worse, slower, jankier version of the Genesis game. The controls are less responsive, floatier, and everything feels like it moves at a snail's pace. The game gives you the option to play as either Mick or Mac in the options menu, but for whatever reason, no matter what I did, it automatically started the game with the same character, no matter how many times I tried to select the other. One big difference here, though, is that instead of needing to just reach the end, you now need to collect a certain number of colored M's in each stage. It actually makes it slightly more similar to McKids in this regard, as you now have a collection requirement to complete the stage. Unlike McKids, though, if you reach the end of the stage without the required amount of M's, Ronald does not let you finish the stage, and you're then forced to backtrack. The game does tell you how many you need to collect, though, and even though this version is easily worse, this at least gives more of a reason to explore the stages, as they are pretty vertically expansive. In the Genesis game, there's basically no incentive to do anything other than make a beeline to the goalpost, but in this game, it does make you explore a bit, which I guess I should give it credit for, but if I'm being honest here, both of these games are pretty f***ing terrible. Editing Gil here. So in the middle of editing the video, it's come to my attention that there was actually a canceled Super Nintendo version of the game floating around. It was apparently shown off at Winter CES 1999 after the Genesis version was already out, perhaps being the reason it ended up getting canceled since it was too long after the game had already been released for a while. A prototype ROM was dumped online, and while the game can't be completed in any capacity, it is playable and it is out there if you want to try it. There's a level select available, and apparently it has some debug functionality that you can mess around with. There's not much you can really do since most of the enemies are static and can't actually hurt you. In any case, though, it's cool that this is out there, and it's also fun to hear the SNES renditions of the OST. Not long after Global Gladiators, yet another McDonald's game came out for the Sega Genesis, this time developed by Treasure, if you couldn't immediately tell. If you're unfamiliar with the games Treasure's made, I don't think it's necessary to dive into that, but just know that McDonald's Treasureland Adventure is like the most treasure-looking game imaginable. We're back to a straightforward platformer, this time with absolutely no added fluff. The plot of the game is pretty simple. I'm not really expecting deep lore here, but Ronald finds part of what appears to be a treasure map. Excited at the prospect of not only hidden treasure, but going on an adventure, I guess, or whatever, decides to go on the hunt for the remaining pieces of the map. Unbeknownst to him, though, 3 bad guys possess the other 3/4 of the map, and now it's up to you to make it through each world and defeat each boss to collect all the pieces of the treasure map. The controls are very straightforward here. Ronald can jump, shoot a magic projectile attack, and use his scarf as a grappling hook to climb up designated grapple points. That's it. That's literally everything you can do in the game, save for ascending or descending your scarf while attached to a grapple point, but that's not at all necessary for like 98% of the game. There's also items scattered throughout each stage, such as free lives, power-ups, and these little balloons that save you from dying when falling into a bottomless pit. The magic power-up increases your attack power, and the rest of the items do various things like increase your health or give you extra continues. These items can also be purchased in the shop, which can be entered through doors found in each stage. Most of the stages are very straightforward and do incorporate a lot of the grappling mechanics with the occasional auto-scroll level just to spice things up. Boy, do I wish developers would stop spicing things up because I've never met a person in my life who's ever said they like this shit. Most enemies can be taken out with a hit or two, and for roughly 75% of the game, it's actually pretty damn easy and straightforward, with not a whole lot of challenge to be found, save for the final world where the difficulty for some reason ramps way up. It's nothing truly difficult, but it is enough of a spike for it to be hard not to notice. Now, the bosses are actually kind of cool and require a little strategy that you probably wouldn't expect from a game like this. See, at first glance, it might be a bit confusing what you're supposed to do to defeat the bosses. I mean, it's seemingly impossible to damage them, and you might end up running around wasting your time not understanding why you can't damage the first boss in this baby-ass game. Well, if you happen to talk to the Hamburglar towards the end of the first world, then you give him a few gems, which also act as your health, by the way, he'll let you in on a little secret. See, each boss has this attack where this beam shoots out of their mouth. When this happens, they suck away one of your gems, and by extension, also your health. When they do this, though, they actually need to chew and swallow the gem, and this is your window to get some attacks in. So it's this game of purposely taking damage and then retaliating. It's actually pretty unique for such a simple game, much less a licensed McDonald's game. I'm not saying it's some genius example of boss design, but it's a cool little twist that's actually a bit more engaging than if it were just a simple spam your projectile attack till they die boss. Like I said, this game is very, very easy, and even the areas where you do kind of take a lot of hits due to stage hazards, it all stays like just above Kirby difficulty. That is until the final world. Once you beat the first 3 worlds and their bosses, and you complete the treasure map, turns out the treasure is on the moon or something, so now Ronald needs to go to the moon. Here, there's low-gravity physics, and the level design and enemy placement starts getting just a bit frustrating and a whole lot cheaper. Once again, it's not crazy hard, and if you really want to, you can kind of strong-arm your way through by taking advantage of the balloons and iframes, but this section of the game does get noticeably less fun. I mean, the entire game isn't exactly riveting, but none of it is egregious, and it controls well. This final world, though, I will admit, is pretty annoying, and the biggest example of it is its final boss. I'm sure you've seen a ton of bosses with this type of setup. We've all probably seen a ton of bosses like this. 3 planes the boss can appear on and trap you in, and doors that shuffle. You move between platforms by taking one of the doors which swap their places after each cycle. In concept, this boss is fine. In practice, it's a pain in the ass. I didn't die against any boss in the game until this final one. It's really easy to find yourself trapped in with the boss with no way to avoid his attacks, and it's really unforgiving if you happen to take the wrong door, giving you almost no time to correct yourself and taking a huge chunk of your health if you get hit. The idea is to get above the boss, get your gems eaten, and then move to a door that has a match on the same plane as the boss and then attack. But unlike the other bosses, you can only get 1 hit in during each cycle, and you pretty much need to play perfectly or you'll end up dying super quickly. It also doesn't help that the boss occasionally decides to stop on the only door that you can take to get to where he is, so sometimes you need to just eat a hit and can't do anything about it. I hated this. This was very annoying, but eventually I did it and beat the game. McDonald's Treasureland Adventure is super simple, only like 2 hours long and pretty damn easy. I wouldn't say it's great by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a quality game. The controls are pretty good, the music is good, it's colorful and nice to look at, and I think it's worth playing at least once. It's definitely decent and has a lot more polish than anything else I've played so far, but you just probably won't be playing it more than once. If you're anything like me, at first glance you might think this was a Game Gear port of Treasureland Adventure, and honestly, no one would blame you. The art style is basically the same. Ton of assets were replicated, a lot of the music is the same, and despite the story being completely different too, the elements used in the intro cutscene even look very similar. However, Donald No Magical World is actually a completely original game, this time not developed by Treasure, but by Sega themselves. I get the feeling that this may have started out as a port, but somewhere along the line, they threw that out the window and did something completely different here. As you can probably tell by the title, the game only ever came out in Japan. Cutscene dialogue and the game's title screen all show up in Japanese. However, strangely enough, if you play the game on US hardware, not only does the entire game automatically translate, but it also reveals the game's translated English title, Ronald in the Magical World, and even has a completely redrawn sprite for Ronald for whatever reason. Unlike the other game's story of a treasure hunt, this one still involves the finding of a weird object, but the story is entirely different. Grimace stumbles upon a mysterious box and, by the persuasion of Hamburglar, decides to open it. Out pops a magical map, but this time, there's no treasure to be found. Instead, out pops this wizard magician guy who sucks Ronald's friends into the magic world that exists inside the map. Realizing that he needs to go save them, Ronald jumps in as well, and now has to traverse 4 different worlds to rescue them. Now, as I said, this game, despite looking similar, is completely different from Treasureland Adventure in its design. Gone is the grapple mechanic, and instead, Ronald has a cane/umbrella that he uses to either attack, float in midair, or protect himself from enemies above his head. The game is a bit slow, but the controls are surprisingly tight. The level design, at least in the beginning, is a bit off-putting. It's a lot of really tight corridors, often leading to situations where it's hard to avoid taking damage from enemies, but this does open up a bit as the game goes on. Oddly enough, I think the hardest part of the game is the first few stages. They're actually pretty damn frustrating, and if I'm being honest here, I almost gave up on World 1. I knew there was something here because the game did feel good to play, but the enemy placement and close quarters were really frustrating me. However, I realized the game did have unlimited continues, so I pushed forward. And I'm glad I did because the game gets a lot, and I mean a lot better after those first few levels. Now, similar to how in Treasureland Adventure you had the shops you could utilize in each stage, Ronald in the Magical World instead has these designated bonus game areas. Once you reach a sign with the golden arches, you enter an area where you can play one of two minigames, or choose to leave without playing any. One is a matching game where you win the prize of whichever item you matched, and another where you try to stack together multiple pieces to complete an image of any number of items. There's the Ronald face, which is an extra life, the cane, which buffs Ronald's attack power, the fries, which refills 1 unit of health, the hamburger, which refills all of your health, and the drink, which, if 4 are collected, increases your total health. There's also a couple other items, but those can only be found in the stages themselves. There's the emerald, which, if collected, clears the screen of enemies, and the key, which unlocks various locked doors in each stage. See, the game is a straightforward platformer, but it does require you to find a key in each stage to progress to the end. Luckily, though, it's nothing too confusing, and finding the key is usually pretty straightforward and requires nothing more than a little extra exploration and a small platforming challenge. To my surprise, the bosses are actually all pretty fun as well and require a bit of pattern learning and strategy. They're nothing too hard except maybe one of them, which had a bit of a difficulty spike, but they're all pretty engaging. Except for the final boss, surprisingly, which was actually a pretty huge letdown, his second phase anyway. The first phase requires you to wait for him to attack and then use his projectile hand things to lift you up and bring you to eye level so you can attack, but his second phase, you literally just sit there attacking small enemies till he drops down and then you smack him with a stick one time and he's done. The game isn't perfect. There's definitely some frustrating parts here and there, but it's honestly easy to let slide because the game is super forgiving. You have unlimited continues, and even when you use a continue, you start off at the same stage you game overed on, as opposed to being taken all the way to stage 1 of whatever world you're on. The only exception to this is when you game over on a boss, and you get sent back to the pre-boss stage, which always consists of some big vertical area you need to scale, but it's never too difficult and easy to breeze through after you've done it once. Honestly, this has been my favorite game so far, and I really wasn't expecting to like it. 8-bit Sega games that are actually good are few and far between, and this one looking like a demake wasn't really giving me too much hope, but this one definitely surprised me. It's absolutely a standout on the Game Gear, and it's a must-play if you're interested in any of the games I'm talking about today. This one's got quite the storied history, and it's actually not even something that was commercially released. It's also one of the rarest games available on the Nintendo DS. McDonald's ECDP, which stands for E-Crew Development Program. Now, I'm not a historian by any means, and I'm not here to tell the tale of this game's existence. That's already been done a few times over by people far more qualified than me. But for the sake of getting you up to speed, I'll give you a brief rundown. Back in the late 2000s, Bloomberg did a report on a video game that was apparently produced internally for McDonald's Japan.
And Mike, how exactly are they teaching the McD's members with the, was it the NSDS or something like that?
The DS, the latest version of that, the DSi.
It was basically a training course for employees, obviously kept within the company and never released in any official capacity. For years, though, that Bloomberg report was the only thing that existed of that game. A playthrough was never documented or recorded, and a ROM sure as hell was never dumped. Not even that many of them had been found over the years. There was apparently one person at one point who years later had purchased one of the cartridges, but he unfortunately was unwilling to dump the ROM. Furthermore, even if someone had dumped said cartridge's contents, the game was also locked behind a password system. A password system that I don't even think God himself knew how to crack. Well, a few years back, a YouTuber named Nick Robinson made a whole video documenting how he managed to come across a listing for a copy of the game along with the exclusive McDonald's DSi it came with, as well as the passwords necessary to actually get through the title screen and play the game. I'm not fully versed in how this whole thing worked, but from what I understand, the passwords are intrinsically tied to each cartridge and its save data. I'm not 100% on this, but I believe that's roughly how it works, so it's not enough to just buy a copy of the game. If you somehow manage to come across a copy and it doesn't come with that game's necessary passwords, you're unfortunately SOL. Anyway, along with this documentary he made, he also decided to dump the ROM and release it for everyone to experience, along with his necessary save data, as well as the passwords needed to actually play the game. This whole thing is honestly a huge win for game preservation. Now, at that point, the entire game was in Japanese, so you could kind of futz around and make your way through the training mini-games, but if you don't speak Japanese, you couldn't play any of the quizzes, much less really understand anything that's going on. Luckily, it didn't take long for the community to step in and start translating this thing. It was apparently pretty bare bones at first, but nowadays, a few years later, while it may not be 100% translated, a huge majority of it is, and a patch is available for anyone that's interested. Now, as far as the game itself goes, it's divided into a few different modes. First and foremost, if you want to register yourself as a playable profile, you need to go into the menu that's meant for managers only. Here you can add or delete crewmates. This is obviously meant for McDonald's managers to add employees into their system, but now we can treat this as a character creator, complete with your choice of male or female avatars. Once you create your character, there's a few things you can do here. The first one is, well, it's not really a game, it's just basically study material. Now, I'm sure I would be much better at this thing if I actually studied the material, but seeing as how McDonald's isn't paying me to do homework, I'm just going to fumble my way through this thing. After you get your studying done and you think you're ready to actually try some training, you can get into the main meat of this thing. McDonald's ECDP has a short minigame for nearly every item on the menu, except for nuggies for whatever reason, as well as some other short training exercises for things such as cleaning and customer service. The main content of this thing, though, lies in the food training exercises, where you put together various sandwiches and other food items. You don't really need to study the material to get it done, though, as tapping the screen gives you a hint on what to do next, but warning, you will fail by doing it this way. I'm not going to play the game enough to get good at it, so getting through the content is enough for me, but other people definitely did take the time to get good at it because, and I'm sure nobody is shocked to hear, there's literally speed runs of this thing. After you finish with the training courses, you can make your way to the quizzes. Now, there's for whatever reason 2 sections where you can take quizzes on various McDonald's fun facts. In one section, there's 2 10-question quizzes under both beginner and advanced, and then in another section, there's another 10-question quiz, but despite being basically the same kind of thing, it's got a totally different look to it. I really have no idea why, but if you want to test your knowledge on food safety, boy do I have some good news for you. You can also go look at your entire crew's stats and how they performed, but outside of that, that's basically the entire thing. If you want to just check it out and experience all the content just for the fun of it, it'll really only take you maybe an hour and change to run through it. I will admit though, it's definitely like almost a game enough that you might get hooked trying to get good at it. Now, apparently there was one more DS game that McDonald's made along the same lines as this one called eSmart, and from what I understand, it's very similar, and while ECDP was meant for new employee training, eSmart was meant to be a refresher for more seasoned employees. However, eSmart is not dumped anywhere, and no one anywhere in the world has been known or confirmed to even own a copy. Maybe one day we'll see it, but it seems like most people aren't too hopeful. Weirder things have happened, though. Never say never, I guess. So I figured this one was worth mentioning, but it's more of a side note here. Over the years, McDonald's has had plenty of random LCD games released with Happy Meals. I didn't want to include these because the video would become way too much of an undertaking, and these were mostly just licensed toys that happened to be released through McDonald's, not necessarily McDonald's in theme or anything. However, something came out very recently that's way too weird not to talk about, and it's actually McDonald's related. To celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Chicken McNugget, McDonald's released a limited edition version of Tetris jammed into a giant Chicken McNugget, exclusively in mainland China, for about the equivalent of $4 US. The thing is actually a lot bigger than I thought it would be, honestly not that far off from a Game Boy Color. I'm not going to drag this out because what you see is what you get here. It's an LCD version of Tetris shoved inside a giant chicken nugget. Is it a great version of Tetris? Not really. It works. But it is inside of a chicken nugget, and it does actually play the Tetris theme. What this lacks in being a great version of Tetris, it does make up for in being ridiculous. I can't imagine what possessed them to do this, but I am glad they did. And now for the game that inspired me to make this video in the first place. I'm sure the mass majority of you who are watching this when it comes out are aware, because it literally just happened a couple months ago, but the fact that a major food chain like McDonald's released a Game Boy Color game in 2023 is absolutely ridiculous. So, to commemorate Grimace's recent birthday back in June, McDonald's dropped a browser game called simply Grimace's Birthday. It's not too dissimilar from other browser games. It's fun, pretty short, but something was different here. It didn't look like your typical browser game. To many an observant eye, the game looked and sounded exactly like something you'd have seen on the Game Boy Color back in the day. Well, it didn't take much digging for people to find out that this was, in fact, a straight-up Game Boy ROM built from the ground up. As I said, the game was originally intended to be played via the browser, but once everyone got their hands on the ROM, people started playing it on original hardware. The Analog Pocket, in my case the Mister, the list goes on. Now you can even buy a reproduction cartridge of the game to just straight up pop in your Game Boy. The whole thing's crazy. I'm really not sure why they decided to make a Game Boy Color game. It's just such a weirdly specific thing to do, but I'm glad they did it. Now, as far as the game itself goes, it's actually pretty fun. I'll admit, I kind of hate the dialogue and the cutscenes. It's filled with current-day internet lingo, which I don't think is going to age too gracefully, but outside of that, it's a short, fun little game that consists of a few different game modes. The first two stages of the game are actually skateboarding stages. Grimace needs to roll, grind, and kickflip his way to the end of the stage while collecting birthday shakes before time runs out. Grinding and kickflipping adds to your score, but often grinds need to be used to reach certain areas of the stage. The grind mechanic is simple. You jump up on top of a rail and hold down or up to do either a, I think, dark slide and what appears to be a backsmith, respectively. I say it's simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. It's actually pretty damn cumbersome. It's kind of hard to hold down or up on the D-pad when you're trying to follow it up with precise platforming maneuvers, and because of this, I highly recommend playing it on auto grind mode. Playing it on manual grind mode does give you a 2x multiplier for points, but collecting the shakes and navigating through the stages definitely is a lot more fun with auto grind on. Can you do it without auto grind? Sure. But in my opinion, it's just genuinely less enjoyable that way. Now, as I said, the game is broken up into a few different gameplay styles, and after the skateboarding stages, you get a straightforward platforming stage. You gotta avoid enemies, collect more shakes, and make your way to the end. Very simple. The final stage, though, you hop into a balloon and need to basically Flappy Bird your way to the end. Once you finish the last stage, you get to pick one of 3 birthday cakes and play one last minigame where you blow out the candles and pop balloons to earn bonus points. This is all very simple stuff. The game is insanely short, but it's a quick, fun time and I don't really have too much to complain about. The music is also pretty good as well. If you do manage to collect all 40 shakes hidden throughout the game, you can unlock a golden skateboard, which can be selected on the title screen by pressing select, along with a few other colors you can choose from. The game also has a score attack mode, which is pretty cool. They basically took sections of all the stages and connected them together as one big level, and the goal is to rack up as high of a score as you can before the time runs out. But you can also increase your overall time by collecting the various +5 second time bonuses scattered throughout the stage. These are also counted at the end of the stage, but I have no idea if anything happens if you collect them, and so far it doesn't look like anyone's documented whether or not you earn anything. And there's no actual 100% completion videos on YouTube as far as I can tell. Also worth mentioning is the free skate mode, which, surprise, is a free skate mode. It's just for funsies. Not too much of a point to this, but hey, they added it, can't complain about that. Can't really complain about anything because, if I may reiterate this, McDonald's released a completely free-to-play Game Boy goddamn Color game in 2023. Overall, this one is definitely worth checking out. It's not going to be an extremely riveting gameplay experience, but it's a fun little afternoon distraction, and it's worth playing for the novelty alone. Plus, it's free, so worth the price of admission. Definitely check this one out if you somehow haven't yet. The developers of the game are called Cruel Toys, who I've never heard of before, but it's clear they knew what they were doing because they really nailed it here. It looks pretty much exactly like a game released in the 90s, and if I had no prior knowledge of this, and you had told me this was some unreleased game from back then, I wouldn't even question it. And that's all of them. As you can probably tell by the timeline here, fast food or food brand tie-in games were popular in the 8 and 16-bit eras, but after the 90s, they kind of died down. There's been a couple here and there over the years, but nothing like it was in the 80s and 90s. After Donald No Magical World, we really didn't get anything, and I don't really think training software made specifically for employees really counts. The fact that Grimace's Birthday was made as a Game Boy Color game kind of just further supports this. Fast food licensed games are definitely a very weird relic of the past, but it's a relic I'm glad exists. Quite a few games like these over the years have been good to decent, and they stand out as oddities that could only really exist in the era they were from. If you decide to play anything I covered today, above all else, I would say check out Donald No Magical World. That one really surprised me. Very unassuming 8-bit Sega game that I was not expecting to be as good as it actually was. Other than that, though, I mean, Donald Land was also pretty good after you get past the controls. I'm seeing a theme here. As far as the US releases go, I mean, McKids wasn't great, but I'd say any of these are worth checking out for the novelty alone. Definitely check out Grimace's Birthday, though. That one's easily the most accessible here. It's free, and if I'm not mistaken, you can even play it from your phone. Anyway, that's it for this one. Thanks for coming along for the ride. And thanks again to Pocket Champs for sponsoring the video. Don't forget to click the link in my description if you want to check the game out. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can check out. And if you want to see everything I upload, subscribe and then tap the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, I have a Patreon right there too.